Well, hello and welcome everyone to another lecture in the Understanding MENA series. For today's lecture, we're going to talk about Oman as a highly centralized monarchy under the now former Sultan Qaboos. So this presentation is based on a couple of my articles and my time in the country, and it's called The Personal Nationhood of Oman. So as with Jordan, I'm going to discuss how nationalism was constructed through resistance, but also through centralizing authority under one figure, Sultan Qaboos himself, pictured here uh, to the left in military attire and traditional garb for the national holiday, which was his birthday, and to the bottom right we have a portrait of him in military uniform. I myself have chosen my background the mountains of Muscat. This is by the Corniche in Oman's capital. A photo I took back in I believe it was 2013 or 14, when I visited Oman. It was a wonderful time. So we will continue, and today we will discuss the civil war of Oman and isolationism leading up to that civil war, the isolationism that led up to it, the rise of Sultan Qaboos and his personal nationhood as well, while also discussing Oman's regional role within the context of Iran and the now, I think, pretty much scattered nuclear deal, before looking at Oman's Arab Spring and the questions of succession that were recently answered when Sultan Haytham bin Tariq was selected to succeed Sultan Qaboos. So firstly, Oman is similar to Jordan in some ways in that it is a country that borders various interesting places. It borders Yemen, okay, so the unrest in Yemen. It borders Saudi Arabia. It also borders the UAE. And this is also interesting because it's close to Iran. It has access to the Strait of Hormuz. And certainly with the Qatar blockade as well, Oman has tried to remain neutral. So there's a lot of politics happening in this part of the world, and Oman is sometimes caught between it. It's often seen as a regional mediator. One of the differences between Oman and Jordan is that it has oil. As of 2018, it has 5.4 billion barrels, but it is not an OPEC member. And one of the issues here is for Oman, its oil wealth is quite low. Kuwait, for example, as of 2016, had over 100 billion barrels worth of oil. And from my contacts at various oil firms, another key difference is that Oman, because it's a mountainous region, extraction is more costly in some of those areas. Of course, with the falling oil prices, we're going to see possibly more unrest in Oman. And the sort of, to what extent can you buy off people with oil is another question, not just for Oman, but all of the Gulf as well. So the issue of isolationism, Sultan Qaboos, who passed this year in, I believe, January 2020, he created modern Oman, but before him, his father, who ruled from 1932 until 1970, was Sultan Taimur as-Sayyid. Now here we have a few issues. At the time, Oman was seen as quite poor. It did not have much wealth. It was in heavy debt. Oil had not yet been discovered. And so Taimur as-Sayyid, he basically said, I can't spend money on projects. I'm not able to modernize the country. But further than that, he also had a heavy policy of isolationism in Oman. So foreigners were mostly banned. Ships in the area were not allowed to dock. And on top of that, the few foreigners who were let in, there were rumors that Taimur as-Sayyid actually handled their visa stamps himself. So not only did he personally approve, but he personally stamped those visas in the paperwork. In addition to that, we didn't have national unity, and this is a problem that haunted Oman past 1970 for a while. You had segregation between the coast and the inland peoples. So because of that, you didn't really have a united country. And of course, oil exploration saw some promise, but we hadn't yet got to the point where there was oil wealth. What Taimur did, by the way, which was quite interesting, some of the politics he did was when his country began to show an interest in engaging oil firms, or perhaps I should say when oil firms became interested in Oman, he played them out against each other. He would charge them for the rights to explore, and he would get the British, who were a traditional ally, a bit nervous if he started talking to US oil companies, so they would try to counteroffer. Having said that, this is an individual who seemed to increasingly rely on the Brits. He was seen by some as a weak ruler. He just could not rule effectively. There were incidents in which the Brits had to intervene, and the problem with those interventions was that it made him look like a puppet to his own people. So when the Brits intervened militarily, and he toured an area called Nizwa in the center of the country to celebrate his victory with the British troops. It looked more like he was being paraded around by them, and this created a very negative image. Things only got worse after 1966, when one of Taimu's slaves attempted to kill him with a knife, and he was stopped by a loyal slave to the Sultan. However, after this event happened, the Sultan was never really seen in public again. He retreated to his compound in Salalah in the south of the country, in what's called the Dhofar region, and never really came out. And when his son, Qaboos, returned from Europe, having graduated from Sandhurst and also toured Germany and parts of Europe, he was put into isolation. He had access to no one except for his tutor, I believe, books and recordings. That was it. Part of it, by the way, was because at that time, Sultan Timur was already worried that his own son might overthrow him, so he isolated him. The Brits were not happy with how things were playing out. They saw Timur as someone who was not reliable, he didn't have a backbone. And so there were also questions of what's going to happen for the Brits. Are they going to continue this relationship, or are they going to try to conspire to replace him with someone more pliable from the royal family? So from 1962 to 1975, we had a civil war that was in part provoked by the Sultan's isolationist policies. In 62, let's remember, we had the revolution in Yemen against royalists and the creation of an Arab republic. And at this time, we saw that Dhofar, which was the seat of Timur's power, became the start of the rebellion. Now, although the rebellion may have started as a war against him because of his isolationist policies, it morphed into a proxy conflict funded by various communist powers, including Arab republics who wanted to end Assaid rule. We can link that back to Jordan and also to Gamal Abdel Nasser, the idea that the era of monarchy is over. And so there were certain republics that claimed to be communist or socialist that would push for the end of monarchy across the Middle East. So we see here, again, as with Jordan, an era in which pan-Arabism and monarchy starts to clash. This photo I took here to the right is of various weapons that were confiscated from rebels during the Civil War. They're now on display at the Armed Forces Museum. One of the issues we have here, going back to, nationalism is a concept that's quite contested across the Middle East. The idea of a united nationalism is challenged when it comes to Oman because we have here rival claims. Remember, we have the coast and the inland segregated from each other. So we don't really have the feeling of a united Oman. And the Dhofar rebellion came atop a failed rebellion from 1955 to 58. And it was at this time that the Saudis actually had been involved to try to back various religious leaders to overthrow the existing sultan. And we saw here Imam Ghalib al-Hanai, who is meeting in this photo, he's meeting Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, as you can see here. This was one of the individuals who had religious authority in Oman. He was respected as a religious figure. And so he wanted to actually create an imamate instead of a sultanate of Oman. So we see here split nationalism. And by 1970, we have a lot of pressure. Timur has become very unresponsive. He's not listening to the Brits. There's a civil war, so people are growing impatient, and that included his son, Sultan Qaboos, or the eventual Sultan Qaboos. So when Qaboos himself ascended the throne, he was about 29 years old, and he overthrew his father with the subtle help of British officers and cooperation of the Omani armed forces as well. And in his speech, he said, the first act as Sultan, as your Sultan, if you like, is the abolition of restrictions on your life, or on your lives, I'm sorry. In the past, our country was famous and strong. Let us regenerate that glorious past and take a respectable place in the world. So again, the idea of, we had a glorious past. This is very, very common with nationalism and tradition, the idea of we're drawing on the past because in the past things were good. So here we see a young sultan who is trying to sidestep his father. And number one, he's going to remove restrictions that were kind of the reason there was a conflict in the first place. And number two, he's drawing on the past to say, we were glorious at one point. We can be so again. We can take back control. Now, Qaboos himself had been, as I said, isolated, I think, for over a year by the time the coup took place. And Qaboos was probably quite worried as he understood what was happening with the British command, and he had links to the armed forces, the British armed forces. So he knew people, including one Timothy Landon, who was a classmate from Sandhurst, who probably kept him in the loop on what was going on, and he would have been afraid that his own life could be jeopardized if a rival relative could claim the throne. So I think he felt he had to act quite quickly. And on the 23rd of July, Qaboos and his army surrounded the palace in Salalah, cut off communications, and they then forced Timur to abdicate. Point of interest, during the scuffle, and there was one, not too many people were harmed, but Timur was so nervous that he shot himself in the foot, quite literally. And I've written in some articles how that was quite symbolic of how his reign came to an end. He was seen as someone who just couldn't hack it. And if you were to visit Muscat's Armed Forces Museum, the last time I went, the section dedicated to him tries to be kind to him. It doesn't portray him as an enemy or as a rival or turn him into a monster, but it does say, this individual tried his best and he just had too many pressures that he couldn't handle. He was exiled to the UK. First, he went to Bahrain for medical treatment. Then he was moved to the UK, and he died at the Dorchester Hotel in London. Now, the Dhofar rebellion created a form of opposition that would birth nationalism for a new Oman. And going back to what we discussed about Jordan and an external other, in this case we have a civil war, but what Sultan Qaboos did was twofold. Firstly, he pardoned fighters and said, if you put down your arms, all will be forgiven, and he meant it. And this actually had a good effect because a lot of fighters, their quarrel was not with the new sultan, but with the old sultan, and all the restrictions placed on their lives by that previous sultan, the refusal to modernize as well. So a lot of fighters did lay down their arms, and at the same time, what he did, Qaboos, is that he deployed the armed forces twofold. He ensured that they got combat experience in the civil war so that he could decrease British reliance and not have the image that his father had. He then also quite cleverly reminded Omanis that communism was un-Islamic. So here, this poster says, Yad Allah tamahtam al-Shuwaiya. So, in other words, the hand of Allah or God's hand crushes communism. The idea that if you are a communist, you are not a good Muslim. And this is important in the sense that Oman is a religious culture. The Sultan was able to then emphasize his religious legitimacy to remind fellow Omanis that we are all Muslim. Why are we joining communists? And the Sultanate is a religious state. This was actually a very interesting move at a time when we see a lot of republicans and republicanism across the Middle East that draws on communism and socialism. So a reminder of religion being part of your daily life and that you are a Muslim. Therefore, if you are a Muslim, you should follow a Muslim state. So a very interesting move by Sultan Qaboos. So creating modern Oman meant several things. Firstly, one of the things Qaboos did was that he united Oman as one country. No longer Sultanate of Muscat and Oman. Henceforth, it would be called the Sultanate of Oman. And the interior and the coast would be one. People would be united. And in his first speech as well, he said, over the next few days, I will visit my people. In other words, he wanted to humanize his rule. And one of the things he did as well was that the Sultanate's armed forces, or the SAF, as the war wound down, he deployed them to build hospitals, open schools, provide welfare, because he wanted to humanize them and create trust between them and the people. Also, by touring the nation, which is something he did for a while until I think his health became poorly, he's trying to remind Omanis that he is not his father. He is not an isolationist. He is forward-looking, and he wants his people to be looking forward with him. So let's not forget oil. Oil is central to welfare in so many Gulf states. And the coronavirus, of course, is challenging that. But the thing is that oil began flowing under Sultan Timur. In other words, oil was found and then started to flow and be exported during the start of the Civil War. But because of the way things went, Qaboos was able to take credit. So there's a lot of oil flow that was poured into the war. And as that wound down, of course, you could go from warfare to welfare, and oil money helped pay for that. Extensive infrastructure, hospitals, schools, achieving a high literacy rate and ending domestic isolation. This happened in the 70s during the oil boom. So the question then becomes, to what extent is it about Qaboos's political agility versus the luck of oil flowing at the right time and providing the state with much needed funds? We see here a personal nationhood. During his time, Qaboos is not only Sultan, he's the Prime Minister, the Finance Minister, the Foreign Minister. He's the head of the armed forces. He has a highly centralized rule. And again, if you look at the Armed Forces Museum, you will see how his father is discussed briefly but kindly. This poster here that I've used for other lectures talking about the Middle East shows the celebration of Oman's National Day, which is actually Sultan Qaboos's birthday. And to the right, he's dressed in, should we say, traditional garb, and to the left, he's wearing a military uniform. And that communicates security and also the military background, a reminder that he ended the Dhofar War. Now, I remember through my research and whatnot, my contacts, a journalist talking about when he was going to interview Sultan Qaboos in the 80s and he was going to the palace, he was informed by a minder, if you like, who was in the British Armed Forces, you are free to ask Qaboos any question you wish, but do not ask about his father. So the question then is, did he fear meeting his father's fate, which did not happen? He died in Oman. I believe he had cancer. He was not overthrown. Another aspect of Omani rule under Qaboos was understanding the importance of tribalism and the merchant class. Now, Oman is a seafaring nation, so trade is a part of the culture, but also tribalism. And one of the things that Qaboos did is, in addition to meeting tribes in the country, he replicated that tribal system. So the idea that in communities, each community has a tribal head, and members of that community come to that individual, the tribal head, with their concerns. So Qaboos said, okay, we will have Majlis Ashura, the consultative council, in a sense of parliament, which I guarantee I'm the head of the parliament. The communities, they go to their tribal heads, and the tribal heads, they come to me, and they share their people's concerns. This allows him to replicate the tribal culture, if you like, on a grand scale. So this creates a form of tribal nationalism almost. And at the same time, Qaboos had the final say. So again, speaking to some of my contacts, I remember one gentleman said that when promoting tourism, there were some who were pushing for the ban of alcohol, and Qaboos said, no, we're not going to ban it because I want Western tourists to come in. We may not serve alcohol everywhere. We may restrict it to hotels, but we're not going to ban it outright as they've done, for example, in Kuwait. So discussing Oman's regional role, this is an interview I had with Al Jazeera regarding the Qatar blockade. And at the time, a lot of people were looking at Oman's role because of their neutrality. I mean, this is a country that has good contacts with the US, good contacts with the Brits. They also are friendly with Iran. And it's interesting because during the Civil War, Iran's Shah Pahlavi assisted Qaboos with, I believe, weapons and infantry. But when he was overthrown, Oman did not demonize the Islamic Republic. They decided that, no, we're going to keep this relationship. And it is that relationship that has allowed the nuclear deal, for example, to at least have had a framework up until Trump decided to reverse that progress. So Oman, during the Qatar blockade, left its ports open. It did not take sides, and it allowed air traffic to continue in a neutral manner. So we see that although domestically Qaboos pushed personal nationhood, for his foreign policy and regional policy, he wanted to remain quite neutral. And this is again going back to the nuclear deal of Iran. After 1979, when the Shah was overthrown, Oman kept relations with the new Iran, if you like, and they've been used for communications between Iran, the US, and the UK. By 2009, Sultan Qaboos visited Iran. He visited Ahmadinejad after his re-election, and he was one of the first leaders to do so within, the Gulf and whatnot. We then had the JCPOA as a result of Omani dialogue. So what Oman did was they acted as facilitator, as a go-between. They would speak to the US and to the Iranians and say, look, would you be willing to talk about a deal? They would help organize meetings, and as far as I'm aware, they then kind of left the room and let these two sides talk together. But they were a strong facilitator, and up until what happened with Trump, I do believe that Iran's nuclear deal was as much Oman's legacy as anyone else's, and as much Qaboos's legacy as anyone else's. This idea that this Gulf state could have a successful foreign policy that embraces all. We've also seen how Oman has balanced US and Iran relations with also other allies. We've seen, for example, now a visit by Benjamin Netanyahu to Oman, which would have been unprecedented not that long ago. And I do believe that this was Oman's way of turning to other possible allies at a time when the blockade itself between Qatar and Saudi Arabia is causing the GCC to fragment. We will also see other possible players, China, Russia. Certainly, China has been, up until recently, investing in Oman and across the Gulf, and I think that the Oman government is quite happy with that. They're happy to welcome other players because they want to see that within the Gulf, Saudi Arabia is not the only player on the block. Oman's alliances. Here we have the classic conundrum of U.S. military access, which is always a point of contention across the Middle East. U.S. military access means, in a sense, U.S. protection. But what about Chinese investment? We've seen more recently that the Chinese, as part of their Belt and Road Initiative, have been very happy to invest in the GCC across, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE as well, and they seek business and cultural cooperation. I know from my time in the education sector that in the UAE and other places, because of these growing ties, some schools are offering Mandarin. So suddenly people within the Gulf can learn Mandarin and consider tourism in China and vice versa. For Oman, there was an investment of almost 11 billion US dollars in what's called the Duqm port. The idea that this port would be developed in cooperation with China. And in November of, I believe it was 2019, we saw a Chinese delegation visit Oman to strengthen their cooperation. So the message that sends, again, is it sends a message of, with regards to the US, that there are other major actors in the Gulf now, so Russia, but also China. And the Arab Spring that touched Oman. This is an interesting point because, like Jordan, we didn't see an overthrow of the monarchy, but it came towards the end of Qaboos' reign. In other words, Qaboos may not be remembered for how he reacted to the Arab Spring or not. He's probably more remembered for uniting the country and ending a civil war. Now, Sultan Haitham, of course, who's just gotten started, he's dealing with the coronavirus, he's dealing with unemployment, and he's dealing with low oil prices. So really, the Arab Spring that brushed Oman and that may return is going to be on his plate more than it was in Qaboos's. So February 2011, of course, we have the typical and understandable demand for job creation. At the same time, I find it interesting that many protesters during this period held up posters of the Sultan Qaboos, and they basically said, our quarrel is not with him, it is with his cabinet, it is with people we feel are giving him poor advice. And I remember when I visited Oman in 2013, I visited a professor there who I knew from my time in Geneva, and he was hired at Sultan Qaboos University because the political science department had been expanded. And this is one of the reactions that Qaboos had. He said, I want more politically active and politically educated youth. So we're expanding the politics department at our university. Another pattern that he had was to arrest and pardon. So in a sense, carrot and stick. Activists who perhaps made too much noise, some of them would be arrested. They would go to trial and eventually they would be pardoned after a year or so. And so this is something he did probably to have the image of a paternal but benign ruler, that he wasn't going to allow activists to become too aggressive, but he also was going to issue warnings. In a sense, having a trial and then providing a pardon was a way of saying, okay, I'm going to give you another chance. This is probably how he tried to present it. At the same time, in 2014, we did see a former commerce minister, Mohammed al-Qusaybi, jailed on corruption charges, which possibly was seen as perhaps a victory, but it's also another way of deflecting responsibility. This is a highly centralized monarchy, remember that. A way of deflecting responsibility from yourself onto other government figures. By 2019, in January, there were even further protests over unemployment, and of course one of the issues here is oil price fluctuations. The oil price is doing even worse as I'm speaking because of the coronavirus. So it's not just Oman, but a lot of other countries are going to be feeling the oil crunch, and it's going to be a problem. The Majlis al-Shura is effectively a democratic process without democracy per se. And as I was saying, we have this carrot and stick method that Qaboos used, arresting and pardoning, allowing for there to be a consultative assembly, but where he is the ultimate head of that assembly. Succession. It was very interesting looking at questions of succession, who was going to succeed Qaboos or not. He had no heir, he had no children, and his health had become, I think as of the mid-2000s or maybe 2010s, it had become a bit questionable. So the question of an heir was always on the mind of various political commentators. Now, the there was a rumor that he had a sealed envelope. I believe this was very true. He had two sealed envelopes with names of who he preferred to succeed him. And when I had a talk with some high ranking officials, I believe it was last year, one of them said to me that at some point during his reign, Qaboos changed his mind. So he opened the envelope and he changed the name of the person who was in there. That person, as we found out in January 2020, was Haytham bin Tariq al-Said. Now, this individual was chosen from Qaboos' sealed envelope to show that the country has a smooth succession. Instead of the royal family debating for 3 days, which they could have done, they went straight to the envelope, they opened it, and they chose Tariq bin Said, Haytham bin Tariq al-Said as the new sultan. So he has now become Sultan Haytham. Excuse me. This individual has now got to deal with COVID-19. And what's interesting is it seems they were chosen for their business background and the fact that they got involved in Vision 2020, which is now called Vision 2040, the attempt to diversify Oman. So their business background may have been a huge step in why they were chosen, but also the fact that they have held various posts that have allowed them to network with other government advisors and other government figures from around the region and the world. As I said, COVID-19 is hitting everybody. And in Oman especially, I'm curious whether or not Haytham is going to draw on wartime rhetoric to address COVID-19. So a return to the idea that we're at war, which would allow him to create his own legacy or legitimacy separate from Qaboos, because right now he's just gotten started. That's one. And secondly, he is drawing on Qaboos' legacy. There are photos of him, for example, standing in his office, and although he's Sultan, there's a portrait of Sultan Qaboos behind him, which shows that he is still creating his own legacy and his own ruling style as well. And he will now have to deal with the Arab Spring, low oil prices, and coronavirus. These are not easy things to deal with. So I'm not sure how Vision 2040 will actually pan out. So Oman is a highly centralized country in terms of its politics. It really is a question of personal nationhood. For Qaboos, he succeeded in birthing the modern Oman as his state, where he was seen as the father of modern Oman. So nationalism as a form of paternalism is very interesting. It's very, very interesting indeed, because he created the modern Omani state, and he ruled from 1970 up until 2020. So he ruled for a very long time. And we can see that people respect him in Oman. There were many who were crying at his funeral, who lined the streets to say goodbye to him. So he was very well respected. At the same time, what about his successor? Now, there's the question of, whether or not that successor would have had royal backing. They did. This transition was very smooth. But there's still the issue of he's not Qaboos. Sultan Haytham is not Sultan Qaboos. And if you view footage very carefully of the coronation process, I think you can glimpse one or two moments where Haytham looks nervous because he knows that he's got a job that maybe he didn't want, and it's not going to be easy. So before we go, let's discuss some fun facts about Oman instead of everything being just politics. So number one, Amouage. Oman is home to one of the most expensive perfume brands in the world called Amouage. It was created by Sultan Qaboos as a way of showing the world some of Oman's heritage, which is perfumery. We also see to the left here the Khanjar. This is an antique silver dagger that's very common in the Gulf, but especially in Oman itself. And also they have a rain festival, which I believe is in September in the south of the country, the Salala Monsoon Festival. And here, around this time, you'll see that the whole country, or at least Salala, becomes green. This is very unusual. A lot of people who have never been to the Middle East assume it's all desert, and that's wrong. There's a lot of greenery if you know where to go, and I really hope to return after lockdown to Oman. Finally, the mountains. Oman is very mountainous. It's a beautiful country. It really is. And I remember I was at a shopping mall. I came out of the movie. I went to the food court, and right outside, there was a massive mountain staring back at me. It was awe-inspiring. So architecture within Muscat is built into those mountains. Thank you very much for another good lecture, and I hope to see you all again soon.